Hello, I'm Jessica Teets. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Middlebury College, and I wanted to talk to you today about demographic change in China. And the reason that I wanted to talk about this topic is that there are some fairly large demographic changes that China is going to experience over about the next 2 to 3 decades. And these changes are very large and are transforming China. And I want to try to focus in on what sort of public policy changes are going to be needed in order to address these changes. And so the first graphic, and this is meant to be slightly humorous, but represents the inverted demographic triangle that we're seeing develop in China. And this is where you have an only child who needs to work in order to support 2 parents and 4 grandparents. So the reason that I want to talk about these demographic changes is that Xi Jinping's administration has proposed a new social contract called the China Dream. And we see that the China Dream focuses on economic reform, the revitalization of the party, and also creating a social safety net. And so I want to focus in on these demographic changes that we're going to see facing China from about 2020 until about 2050, and see how these things will impact Xi Jinping's China Dream policy. And so the first shift that I wanted to look at is this large demographic shift from a younger working population to an older retired population. And this is sometimes called, more descriptive way, the graying of China. What we're seeing in China is a really rapid transition from a younger demographic to an elderly demographic. The only other transformation that's been as fast as this we've seen in Japan. However, in Japan, when this transition started, Japan was already a fairly developed and wealthy country. Whereas for China, they're facing this large demographic shift at a point in time at which they are not very developed. So for example, if you look at the chart that I've posted, you can see China, Japan, and the United States represented. And this is looking at per capita GDP versus population ages 65 and up. And so if you look at Japan, you see this really stark and really fast shift in demography. So you can see at about the 10,000 per capita GDP mark, Japan dramatically shifts from a younger population to an elderly population. However, it's happening at this 10,000 per capita GDP mark. Whereas if you look to the left of the graph and you look at China, you can see that China also is starting this rapid uptick of having a larger proportion of their population 65 and older, but at a much lower level of income. We're looking at about 5,000 per capita GDP. The United States also has a smaller elderly population, but again, you can see that our baby boom retiring phenomena that we're facing in the United States right now, that this is also happening at a much higher wealth point. So the problem for China is that it's facing the same demographic challenge that the US is facing with its baby boom population, that Japan is facing right now, but it's facing this problem at a much lower level of income, which means that the policies that they can adopt are likely to be different than a wealthier country. So the way that this demographic shift appears is in the movement of what we sometimes call a baby boom or a bulge population up to higher levels of age. And so, for example, if we look at China in 1990, you see that it mostly looks like the type of pyramid that we would want to see for a strong developing country where the majority of its population is in the working ages. So for example, if in 1990 you look at the bulge in the Chinese population, you're looking at a bulge pretty much between 15 to 35. So this is a working age population. If you look at China in 2005, you see that this bulge has moved up to between 30 and 40. So this is still a working age population. However, as time goes on in 2010 and 2050, you see that we lose that triangle shape where the largest part of your population is a working age population. And instead we start to see that this pyramid is top heavy. It becomes inverted where the largest group of your population is at retirement age and you have a very small working age population supporting that group. So this is the problem that China's facing beginning in about 2020, 2025, that they're going to have the largest proportion of their population at retirement age. And again, for a low income country, this is a difficult place to be in because it limits the public policies that you can adopt to address it. So the other thing that we see that's such a challenge for having this elderly demographic is that we don't see a very established safety net in China for the elderly. So when we look at this population aging that's going to happen, it's going to be very rapid. So for example, by 2025, over 13% of the population will be over the age of 65. However, this is going to happen while China's at a lower standard of living than any other country in history. And so what we're going to see then is this combination of a population that needs social support, but a government that doesn't have as many resources to deal with it. We also see that because the safety net isn't very established for the elderly, that we only have about 1/6 of the workforce that are currently covered under retirement programs through state-owned enterprises. In recent years, the Chinese government has tried to expand a pension system that looks a lot like the Social Security system in the United States, where out of an employee's wages, the employer pays a tax for each employee, as well as the employee also paying a certain percentage into the system. So we are seeing the creation of these pension systems, but again, they mostly cover an urban population that are permanent residents. So migrant workers working in the city or rural workers are not paying into these systems. So we don't see that there is a very established safety net for the elderly in China. We don't see comprehensive health care or a comprehensive pension system. So this is going to be something that needs to be addressed in China, but again, very quickly, as we're going to see by 2025, this demographic bubble has reached retirement age. Another challenge that we see as far as changing demographics in China that might challenge Xi Jinping's China Dream reforms is an emerging middle class. So in addition to the coming demographic change of having more of an elderly population, we're also seeing an emerging middle class in China. And so, for example, in the graphic that I'm showing you, we see that more households are entering the middle class. So in 2010, we're seeing only a small number of households, about 60 million, with an income greater than 10,000 per year. But by 2020, we see this jump to 230 million households. And so this is a huge gap or a huge increase that we're seeing in the emerging middle class, and it's happening very quickly. So again, in a decade, we're seeing this dramatic increase. Now, as far as an emerging middle class, we don't know exactly what the political desires or political aspirations will be for this emerging class. And so it's difficult to know whether the emerging middle class will be supportive of Xi Jinping's China Dream policies or whether there will need to be different policies adopted to address the emerging middle class in China. I wanted to take a minute here to talk about who the middle class is in China, because this is a very difficult concept. So in countries like the United States, where we have political categories around the middle class, sort of Main Street versus Wall Street political terminology, there's an identity, there's a commonly shared identity of what it means to be middle class. And so this might be a certain income level or a certain profession, but there are ideas about who is in the middle class. And in the United States, when we poll people and ask them if they're in the middle class, they can usually target whether they're in the middle class, the lower middle class, the upper middle class. But in China, when we ask the same question, there doesn't seem to be a shared identity of what is the middle class. Now, this might be partially a political constraint in that China as a socialist country is supposed to be a classless society, but I think more nuanced research also shows us that it's really difficult to understand what the middle class is because it's such a new group in China. So I wanted to take a minute and look at who is in the middle class in China. And what we see as far as age demographics, we're primarily looking at people who are fairly young. So we're looking at people who were born in the 70s. And so the 70s and the 80s really are the largest demographic here that are in the middle class. We also can see, if we look at occupation by sector, that the top 3 sectors for the middle class are finance, trade, and manufacturing. And so mostly we're looking at people who are stockbrokers or people who are managers for different firms engaged in trade or manufacturing. And if we look to the right at the graphic, we can see this is just an example based on statistics of what an average middle class family would look like in China. So a typical middle class family, you're looking at a husband who's an engineer, maybe with a state-owned enterprise, and a wife who works in real estate. They earn about $10,000 a year. They own an apartment, and they spent about $37,000 on that, mostly from savings and family assistance. But also increasingly we see the use of mortgages in China. They spent about $4,000 on their wedding, which is a large budget. They probably already own a car, but they dream of owning a really nice car within 10 years. And if we look at the same scenario of who the average middle class person is in a rural setting, we can see that one of the richest villages in China is Huaxi. And so the average middle class family will have an income of about $6,000, and they will also own a house and a car, so one per family. So when we think then about the middle class in China, what we're seeing is an emerging middle class that has benefited dramatically from economic reforms that China has undertaken. And so this leads us to 2 views of the middle class as far as what kind of role will the middle class play in politics in China in the future. One argument is that because the middle class has become the middle class through Communist Party policies about economic reform and stability, there'll really be a force for the status quo. So they will support the efforts of the party to engage in more economic reform, perhaps unless that economic reform fundamentally challenges their position in the middle class. We also see, though, that the middle class increasingly are involved in all sorts of protests. Most of these protests are the not in my backyard or NIMBY variety. So protests where people don't want high-speed rails built right behind their apartment buildings, or where they don't want chemical factories being built in their neighborhoods or near their schools. So this, though, shows us a middle class that has certain expectations for the Communist Party and will work to make sure that the Communist Party addresses those one way or another, either through public policy or through street protests. And so it's difficult for us to say now whether this emerging middle class will be a force for stability and of support for Xi Jinping's China Dream reform policy, or whether in fact they will ask for things that differ dramatically from what Xi Jinping has proposed in the China Dream policy. But one thing is very clear, that these 2 large demographic shifts that are going to be occurring starting in 2020, that these 2 things are going to have a major impact on politics in China, the path of economic reform, and a huge impact on Xi Jinping's China Dream reform package. And so both the middle class and the large percentage of the elderly in China will need to be addressed in public policy, and it's unclear now how Xi Jinping intends to address these 2 demographic challenges. So when we think then about what the implications are for the party state, the questions that we would want to ask are, what are the problems presented by the rapidly aging population? So what problems need to be addressed? And I would argue that one of the things that Xi Jinping's administration needs to think about as part of their reform package is in creating a safety net that takes care of the elderly in a very different way than they were taken care of in the past. So rather than depending on families to take care of the elderly, the government needs to think about other policies that can be used to take care of family members. Again, if we have one child working to support two parents and four grandparents, it's no longer realistic to expect that all elder care will happen at the family level. Unfortunately for the government, because this is such a large population group, they're not going to be able to create something like comprehensive elder care that you might see in Western European countries. So instead, we're going to see, I think, a lot of experimentation around different ways to take care of the elderly that are more cost effective. And this will probably result in a mix of policies, some family spending, some local government spending, some private market solutions, and some central government programs. It's very clear, though, that this can't be addressed through just one policy. One promising reform that I've seen is the outsourcing of elder care to private enterprises and to nonprofit organizations that are delivering more targeted care and not sort of the one-size-fits-all care that's offered through nursing home services. And these are services like meal delivery, grocery shopping services, elderly bathing services. In China, this is called the 2-bath-a-week service. And so I see a lot of willingness to experiment with public policy to create some sort of solution. But this is clearly going to be an area in which the new administration will have to think long and hard about what sort of comprehensive social safety net can we build, given our population, given our per capita GDP, in order to best address this demographic shift. And then the question of the middle class. So are they a force for democratization? Are they going to push much further than Xi Jinping might like for things like judicial independence and constitutionalism, which he talks about in the 60-point plan? Or instead, are they going to focus more on the party playing a strong role in preserving economic growth and social stability? So will they be more of a status quo force? And I think that both of these demographic changes force us to really think about Xi Jinping's reform agenda as presented in the China Dream or the 60-point plan, in that both of these changes are going to shape the nature of public policy and what the public policy challenges are that China faces beginning in 2020. And so Xi Jinping is going to need to adapt his reform agenda to these two demographic challenges in order to address them. And the open question is, how will he do that, and will his solutions be effective?